I was standing on the front porch of the house I grew up in. 3 small children pressed close behind me. A black plastic garbage bag slumped at my feet like a body, and I lifted my hand and knocked on the door the way I had knocked on it 10,000 times in my life. My own mother's house. My own father's door. The same brass knocker my grandfather had installed before I was born. And those people, the 2 people who had taught me what a family was supposed to mean, looked at me and looked at my children and shut that door in our faces. My brother actually laughed. My sister, the youngest of us, came out into the hallway just long enough to deliver a small, calm speech about responsibility. And then I was alone again on the wooden boards of that porch, with the cold creeping up through the soles of my shoes. I did not scream. I did not pound on the door. I did not even let my face change, because there were 3 pairs of eyes behind me, and one of those pairs belonged to a 4-year-old who still believed I could fix anything in the world that broke. So I stood very still, and I looked at the painted wood of that door for 1 long second, and I made myself a private promise. 3 words, no more. Watch what happens. I want to tell you exactly what happened next, because 18 months later, every single person on the other side of that door no longer recognizes the woman I have become, and that is not an exaggeration. My name is Maren, and a year and a half ago, I had what most people, if they were being honest, would describe as a perfectly average American life. Not the kind of life you photograph for the internet. Not the kind anyone envied. Just a quiet, working, mortgage-paying, lunch-packing, laundry-folding life. I had a small house in a small neighborhood with a dishwasher that ran loud, and a minivan in the driveway with a cracked left tail light I had been meaning to get fixed for almost a year. I had 3 children who were growing up faster than I was emotionally prepared to handle, and every morning I poured cereal into 3 mismatched bowls and pretended I had the whole thing under control. Before I tell you what unraveled, let me say this, because I know who is listening right now. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and felt completely invisible, if you have ever asked someone who was supposed to love you for the smallest amount of help and watched them weigh you like a stranger, please hit that subscribe button before you go any further. This story is going to land somewhere tender, and I want you here for all of it. And in the comments below, tell me about the moment you realized the people who should have known your worth were the same people who underestimated it the most. I read every single one, and I think you will be surprised how many of us have stood on that same porch in our own way. My oldest, Juniper, had just turned 9 when everything fell apart. She was the kind of child who read the entire instruction manual of a board game before letting anyone roll a die. She watched adults closely, the way some children watch storms, with a steady, almost scientific calm that occasionally unsettled me. Sloane was 6, and she was the opposite. A small, loud comet who believed with her whole body that if she ran fast enough off the back step she would briefly fly. Beckett was 4, the baby, still soft in the cheeks, still convinced that climbing into my lap solved every problem that existed on Earth. Those 3 were the architecture of my entire interior life. Their father was a man named Holden, and we had been married for 10 years by the time the floor gave out beneath us. A decade. That is long enough to forget the shape of the person you were before, which is a thing nobody really warns you about when you stand at the altar in a white dress. You think you are joining a life. You do not realize how much of yourself you will slowly, politely, gradually hand over, without ever consciously agreeing to it. Holden was not a violent man, and he never raised his voice in our house. If he had, I think I would have left much sooner. He was something more insidious than loud. He was a man who could make any failure in the room feel quietly, somehow, like mine. I had spent the last several years working part-time as a coordinator in a medical records office, a job that paid modestly but reliably, and that allowed me to be home in time for the school bus. Holden was a sales director at a logistics company, which is a sentence that means very long hours, a phone always lit up on the nightstand, and a calendar full of business trips to cities I had never visited. He handled spreadsheets and quarterly numbers and bonus structures. I handled fevers at 2 in the morning, lost permission slips, pediatric dentists, science fair posters, and the soft, endless administration of 3 small human lives. I told myself this was simply the shape of a modern marriage. I told myself a lot of things, in those years. The cracks had been there for a long time. They were small and easy to plaster over if you were committed to not seeing them, and I was extremely committed. The way his eyes would slide past me at the dinner table, the way he would come home from a 4-day trip and barely ask about the children, the way our conversations had become logistical exchanges about pickup times and grocery lists. I told myself this was what long marriages eventually felt like, that romance gave way to partnership, and partnership gave way to a kind of practiced cooperation, and that none of this meant anything was wrong. I had a gift for explaining things to myself. It was, in retrospect, one of my most dangerous skills. The end of it arrived on a regular Tuesday afternoon, which is the cruelest detail of the whole story, because it should have arrived with thunder. Holden had left his phone face up on the kitchen counter, while he stepped out to take the trash to the curb, and a message pinged across the screen, and my eyes went to it the way anyone's eyes would. 3 sentences. That was the entire content of the message. 3 short, deeply specific sentences from a name I did not recognize, that made the floor of my own kitchen feel suddenly tilted. I did not have to read the message twice. The information was complete, and final, and instantly rearranged 10 years of memory into a different and uglier shape. I will not describe what the next several days looked like inside my head, because some kinds of pain feel too private to hand to strangers. I went through the motions. I packed lunches. I drove to work. I sat in my car in the parking lot some afternoons and stared at the dashboard until I remembered how to breathe. Holden, when confronted, did exactly what he always did. He said the soft, correct, rehearsed things. He apologized in the abstract. He used words like mistake and pressure and not who I really am. I listened to him the way you listen to a radio playing in another room. Something in me had already left the building, and the words could not reach me anymore. By early spring, I had called a lawyer, a woman with steady eyes who agreed to a payment plan when I explained my situation, and I had filed the paperwork for divorce. Holden moved into a short-term rental on the other side of town within the week, which I took as the final and most honest answer he had ever given me. The house was technically still ours, but the mortgage was tied to his income, and the lawyer warned me that nothing about ownership would be resolved quickly. I needed a place to land while the legal mess slowly untangled itself. I needed, for the first time in my entire adult life, to ask for help. And I made what felt at the time like the obvious, natural, safe choice. I called my family. I came from what I had always believed was a close, even old-fashioned family. My parents, Darlene and Russell, had been married 36 years and still attended church together on Sunday mornings and still danced in the kitchen on their anniversary. My brother Tanner was 32, unmarried, and still living in the upstairs bedroom of our childhood home, where he had constructed an elaborate gaming setup that occupied roughly half of the second floor. My younger sister Camille was 28, recently married, and had developed during her 18-month engagement an unshakable belief that she had personally cracked the code of what made human relationships succeed or fail. I called my mother first because that is what daughters do. I told her in the calmest voice I could manage what Holden had done, what I had found on his phone, that I had already filed, and that I needed a soft place to land for a few weeks. Just the basement, I said. Just the pull-out couch down there where I had slept every Thanksgiving for the past decade, when the holiday ran long. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that has whole paragraphs folded inside of it, and I felt the temperature of the conversation shift before she said a single word. "Maren, honey," my mother said, finally, in a tone I had not heard her use with me since I was a teenager being talked out of something. "You know we just don't really have the space. I want you to understand the layout of my parents' house, because the geography of it matters. 4 bedrooms upstairs, 1 occupied by Tanner and his computer monitors, 2 others entirely empty, dust-ruffled, perfectly made, waiting for nobody. Downstairs, a finished basement with a full bathroom, a pull-out couch, a television, even a small kitchenette my father had installed during a remodel 5 years earlier. There was space. There was, by any honest measurement, a great deal of space. I held the phone against my ear, and I closed my eyes, and I tried very hard to keep my voice from doing anything strange. "Mom," I said carefully, "I have 3 children, I just need a few weeks while the lawyer sorts the house. Just a few weeks, she told me, in the gentle and reasonable voice she used for serious matters, that I needed to think about this more carefully. That divorce was a very large step, and that I should not be making it in a hurry. That Holden was, in her words, a provider, and that these things happened in marriages, and that sometimes the wisest course was simply to work through them. He had cheated. I had the proof on his own phone, in his own handwriting, with another woman's name attached. I had not invented a single piece of it, and yet somehow, in the span of one short phone call, I was the one being told to reconsider. I told her I would drive over the next morning. I did not trust my voice to say anything else. That night I lay in the guest bed in my own house, the bed that had become mine alone, and I listened to the breathing of 3 children in the next rooms, and I tried to imagine what tomorrow would look like. I told myself my mother had been caught off guard. I told myself that when I arrived in person, with the kids, with the reality of the situation visible on the front porch, things would shift. My father would step in. My father had always been the steady one, the practical one, the man who fixed broken things without being asked. I let myself believe that. I needed to believe that, in order to fall asleep at all. The morning came earlier than I was ready for. I loaded the 3 of them into the minivan with the cracked left tail light, along with a single black garbage bag holding the most essential clothes and a few stuffed animals, because I did not yet know how long this conversation was going to take, or where exactly we would be sleeping when it was over. Juniper sat in the front passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the road the way she watched everything, quietly. Sloane chattered the entire drive about a horse she had seen in a picture book. Beckett sang to himself in the back. I drove down the streets I had grown up on, past the elementary school where I had learned to read, and I felt the morning sun on my face, and I tried to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, the same driveway I had pulled into for the first 34 years of my life, and I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, looking up at the brick front and the white trim and the planters my mother kept perfectly maintained on either side of the steps. Then I unbuckled the kids and got the garbage bag out of the back, and we walked up onto the porch together. The wood creaked under my shoes the way it had always creaked. I raised my hand, and I knocked on the door of my own parents' house. I did not yet know that the next 10 minutes were going to permanently divide my life into a before and an after. My father opened the door, and the moment I saw his face, I understood that the conversation was already over before I had even spoken a single word. Russell was not a cruel man. He had never been a cruel man. He was the father who had taught me how to ride a bicycle in the driveway behind me, who had stood in the audience at every school play, who had taught me how to change a tire on the side of the road when I was 16 years old. But his face, when it appeared in the gap of that opening door, was carefully arranged, rehearsed, the face of a man who had already been briefed on a position he was about to deliver. He looked at me, and then he looked past my shoulder at the 3 small bodies standing behind me on the porch, and something complicated moved across his eyes for 1/2 of a second before he locked it down. "Your mother and I have talked it over," he said, and his voice was the polite, measured voice of a stranger at a business meeting, not the voice of the man who had walked me down the aisle a decade earlier. "And we don't think it is a good idea, you staying here right now." The wind moved through the porch and lifted a piece of Juniper's hair, and I could feel her go very still behind me, the way small animals go still when they sense a larger animal nearby. "Dad," I said, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I had intended, almost the voice of a child myself. "Please. I have nowhere else to go tonight. The lawyer says the house could be tied up for months. I just need somewhere safe for the children for a little while. I am asking you for help." He looked at me for a long, long moment, and I watched him glance once again over my shoulder at his 3 grandchildren, the youngest of whom had pressed his small body against the back of my leg, and I saw something in him almost waver, almost. And then his face settled again into that careful, rehearsed shape, and he said, "I am sorry, Maren. We just can't do it right now." That was when my brother appeared, and the timing of his appearance was so precise that I knew he had been listening from the hallway the entire time. Tanner leaned around our father's shoulder with this small, lopsided smirk on his face, the same smirk he had worn when he was 11 years old and had eaten the last cookie and wanted me to know about it. 32 years old, my brother, with no job he was particularly committed to, and no apartment of his own, and an entire floor of that house to himself, and he had the unbelievable audacity to lean into the doorway and say, "Look, Mar, there literally just is not any space here. You know how it is." Those were his exact words. There literally is not any space. I have replayed that single sentence in my head more times than I would like to admit over the past 18 months. I have turned it over and examined it from every angle, because it is such a perfectly compact little lie. It is such an elegant, casual, low-effort dismissal. The kind of sentence a person says when they have already decided that the person they are speaking to is no longer worth the energy of a real conversation. There literally is not any space. In a 4-bedroom house, with 2 empty rooms, and a fully finished basement, and a pull-out couch I had slept on every Thanksgiving of the last 10 years. I did not say anything to my brother. I did not even look at him. I felt Juniper's small hand slip into mine, and I felt her squeeze my fingers once, very firmly, the way you squeeze someone's hand to tell them you are still there. Sloane had moved slightly closer to my hip, and had wrapped both of her arms around my thigh. Beckett, still pressed against the back of my leg, had gone completely silent, which for Beckett was the loudest possible signal that something was deeply wrong. "I will not cry," I told myself, in the calm, steady voice I used inside my own head when the world was breaking in front of me. "I will not cry on this porch in front of these children. I will deal with whatever this is, and I will do it now, and I will fall apart later, in private, when nobody can see it." It was then that my sister appeared, of course, because the scene was not complete without her. Camille materialized in the hallway behind my father like she had been waiting for her stage cue, arms folded across her chest, head tilted just slightly to the right, in that particular way she had, whenever she was about to deliver an opinion she had already decided was wise and unimpeachable. 28 years old, 18 months married, possessor, apparently, of more wisdom about long-term partnership than I had managed to accumulate in an entire decade of being one. "Honestly, Maren," she said, in the gentle and reasonable tone of someone settling a dispute between children, "I think this whole thing might be a little impulsive on your part. Holden is not a bad person. People make mistakes. You have 3 children to think about," she continued, and her voice carried that particular soft confidence of someone who has never actually had to think about 3 children for so much as a single afternoon. "Their stability matters more than your feelings right now." Those were the words she used. "Their stability matters more than your feelings," as if I had not been the entire source of their stability for the entirety of their small lives. As if I had not been the one at every school drop-off, every doctor's appointment, every nightmare at 2 in the morning, every birthday party, every first day of kindergarten, every scraped knee, every fever, as if I had not built the very ground my children were standing on. "Thank you for the input," I said, in a voice so even it almost frightened me. I bent down and I picked up the black garbage bag at my feet, and the plastic crinkled in my hand the way cheap plastic always crinkles, and I felt the weight of 3 small lives' essential belongings pull at my shoulder. I turned my back on that door, and I walked my 3 children back across the porch and down those 4 wooden steps I had run up and down as a girl, and I buckled each of them carefully into their seats in the minivan, with the cracked left tail light. I did not look back at the house. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing my face. I started the engine. I pulled out of the driveway, and I drove down the street I grew up on, with my hands at perfect 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. We ended up that first night in a roadside motel about 30 minutes outside of town, the kind of place with 2 double beds and a humming ice machine in the hallway and a bedspread pattern that no human had ever found attractive. It cost more than I wanted it to cost. I paid in cash because I did not yet know what Holden might do with the joint account. The kids, to my astonishment, treated the entire situation like a small adventure. Sloane immediately announced she would be sleeping in the middle of one of the beds because she was the most important person in the room. Juniper helped me get Beckett into his pajamas and brush his teeth without my having to ask. He fell asleep with one small hand wrapped around the hem of my shirt. I sat on the edge of the second bed after they were all asleep. Three small breathing shapes tangled together in the other bed like a pile of warm puppies. And I let my body finally do the thing it had been refusing to do for the last 6 hours. I cried the small, almost silent cry of a woman who has used up every reserve she had. I cried for maybe 4 minutes. And then I got up, and I washed my face in the small bathroom, and I came back, and I sat on that bed, and I made myself do something my mother had taught me to do when I was a little girl, and the world felt too large. I made myself count what I still had, instead of counting what had been taken. I had a part-time job at the medical records office that I knew, if I asked for it, could become a full-time job. I had a clean 10-year work history. I had a lawyer who had agreed to let me pay her in monthly installments. I had a checking account with enough to keep us in this motel for maybe 3 weeks if I was extremely careful. I had a minivan that ran. I had 3 healthy, whole, ridiculous, beautiful children sleeping in a tangled heap 6 feet away from me. And I had, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the small hot ember of a promise I had made to myself on a porch only that morning. 3 words. Watch what happens. I let that ember sit in my chest. I let it begin, very slowly, to glow. I am going to move quickly through the next several weeks, not because they were not real, and not because they were not hard, but because this story is not, in the end, about how much a person can be made to suffer. It is about what a person decides to build out of the suffering. There were 5 long weeks in that motel. 5 weeks of microwave dinners on a cracked plastic tray, of doing laundry in a coin-operated machine down the hall, of getting 3 children dressed and fed and to school on time, from a single shared bathroom. There was one stretch of about 9 days, during which I ate saltine crackers for dinner, because I had spent the last of my cash on a new pair of shoes for Beckett. He had outgrown his old ones overnight. There were nights I sat on the closed lid of the motel toilet after the children were asleep, the only place in the room with a door that locked, and I let my body shake silently for 10 or 15 minutes before I washed my face and went back out and slept on top of the bedspread with my arms around my son. There were mornings I poured cereal into paper cups because we had no bowls. There were afternoons I sat at red lights and forgot what direction I was supposed to be turning. There was one specific Saturday I will never forget when Juniper came up to me in the parking lot of a grocery store and asked, very quietly, if we were okay, and I lied directly into the face of my 9-year-old daughter and told her absolutely we were. The thing that turned the corner for me was not a dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and my supervisor at the medical records office, a woman named Renata, called me into her small windowless office at the back of the building. Renata was in her late 50s, with iron gray hair she kept cut short, and a face that gave away exactly nothing. I had worked under her for 4 years, and had never once seen her smile in a way that could be described as warm. She gestured for me to sit down, and she folded her hands on her desk, and she looked at me for a long moment with those flat, assessing eyes of hers, and she said, "Maren, are you in a hard situation at home right now? Just yes or no?" I almost laughed, because the question was so simple and so directly stripped of all the polite scaffolding I had been holding up for weeks. I said yes. That was the whole answer. Just yes. She nodded once, the way a person nods when a suspicion has been confirmed. She did not ask me what kind of hard situation. She did not ask for details. She did not offer me her sympathy, or her pity, or any of the soft floating things that people normally offer in moments like that. What she offered me instead was a full-time position with full medical and dental benefits, and a small bump in hourly pay, effective the following Monday, if I wanted it. I said yes again before she had finished the sentence. She nodded one more time and went back to her paperwork. That was the entire meeting. If you have ever had a stranger see you clearly when your own family refused to, please stay with me, because the rest of this story belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. Subscribe if you have not already, because what comes next is the part I most want you to hear. And in the comments below, tell me about the moment you finally realized that someone you had trusted your whole life had been lying to you, not with a single dramatic sentence, but with years of small, quiet, comfortable omissions. The moment you stopped waiting for the apology you had been silently hoping for, and started building the life you were going to live without it. I am going to read those. I promise you I am going to read every single one. I walked out of Renata's office that afternoon, and I sat in the parking lot in the minivan for a full 10 minutes before I could turn the key, because I could not entirely tell whether I was going to laugh or cry or both at the same time. By the end of that week, I had found a 2-bedroom apartment on the cleaner edge of a not very fancy neighborhood, with a rent I could just barely cover on the new salary and a school district that would let Juniper and Sloane stay where their friends were. The bus stop was 2 blocks from the daycare where I had decided to enroll Beckett. The leasing office accepted my first month and security deposit in 2 installments because I asked them nicely, and Renata had written me a reference letter on company letterhead. The apartment was small in a way that felt almost embarrassing at first. The kitchen had exactly 1 drawer that opened smoothly, and the rest required a hard yank with both hands. The bathroom tiles were a particular shade of beige that had probably been fashionable for about 6 months in 1987, and one of the burners on the stove had to be lit with a long match because the ignition had given up sometime during the Clinton administration. But it had a door I could lock with a key that belonged only to me. It had a window in the kitchen that got morning light. It had 2 bedrooms, one for the girls and one I would share with Beckett, and a small living room with enough space for a couch I bought used for $90. The first weekend after we moved in, I took the 3 of them to a discount store, and I let Sloane pick out the curtains for the kitchen window. She chose a violently cheerful yellow, almost the color of a school bus, with a pattern of small embroidered daisies along the bottom. I hung those curtains myself, standing on a wobbly kitchen chair, with Juniper handing me the hooks one at a time, and Beckett supervising from the floor. When I climbed down and stepped back to look at them, the afternoon light was coming through the yellow fabric and turning the whole kitchen the warm color of sunrise, and Sloane clapped her small hands and said, "Mama, our house looks like a happy house now." That was the exact moment I knew we were going to make it. The divorce took 8 months from filing to final signature, and there were stretches of it that felt like trying to walk uphill in deep, wet sand. Holden had hired a more expensive lawyer than I had, a man with cufflinks and a closing argument voice, and he came into the early proceedings swinging for a custody arrangement that was, to put it as charitably as I am able, wildly optimistic about how present Holden had ever actually been in our children's lives. But here is the thing that fathers like Holden never quite understand until it is too late. When you have not been doing the work, you do not have the paperwork. You do not have the school sign-in sheets, the pediatric records, the daycare logs, the field trip permission slips with your signature on them. My attorney, who turned out to be one of the most patient and methodical human beings I have ever encountered, walked into that custody evaluation with a binder so thick it had its own table of contents. 10 years of documented primary parenting, organized by category and date. The evaluator was a kind-faced woman in her 60s, who took notes the entire time without changing her expression, and when the recommendation came back 6 weeks later, it was not in Holden's favor. I received primary physical custody of all 3 children. He received every other weekend and 2 weeks each summer. He was also ordered to pay 8 months of retroactive child support, which his legal team attempted very creatively to reduce, and which the judge declined very firmly to allow them to do. My family found out about the settlement the way news travels in small towns, which is to say, faster than it should, and usually through someone who has no business carrying it. My mother called me the evening she heard. It was the first time she had called my phone in more than 9 months. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, because I needed those 3 rings to decide what kind of voice I was going to use. "Maren, sweetheart," she said, in a tone of warm relief so practiced it almost sounded sincere. "We are just so glad it all worked out for you in the end." As if she had been quietly cheering me on from the bleachers the entire time, as if she had not closed a door on her own grandchildren. "Are you?" I said, and I let the question sit there in the air between us without softening it. There was a pause. Then she began to do the thing she had always done when she felt cornered, the gentle sighing, the soft suggestion that I was being a little oversensitive, that families went through difficult chapters, that the important thing now was to move forward together. I let her speak. I did not interrupt her once. "I have learned," over the past year and a half, that there is a particular kind of power in not arguing with people who are accustomed to winning every argument by sheer exhaustion. When she finally ran out of sentences, I told her quietly that I needed some more time and that I would be in touch when I was ready. I have not rushed that timeline. Camille reached out about 4 months after the settlement, once I had moved the children into a steadier rhythm, and once she had presumably realized that none of her shorter messages were going to be answered. The message she sent was long, paragraphs long, full of words like reflection and growth and perspective, and full of careful acknowledgments that some things she had said on that porch had perhaps come out wrong. I read the entire thing twice, sitting on my couch with a cup of tea going cold in my hand. I thought about her standing in that hallway with her arms folded across her chest. I thought about her phrase, "Their stability matters more than your feelings." I wrote her back something short and not unkind, and I told her that when I was ready, I would reach out. She has not stopped trying since. Tanner has not reached out at all, which is, in its own way, the most honest communication my brother has ever sent me. My father did one thing, and only one thing, and he did it about 10 months after the porch. A small white envelope arrived in my mailbox in mid-December, addressed in his careful slanted handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed my permission slips for school field trips 1,000 years ago. Inside was a plain Christmas card with a single sentence written on the inside in his pen. "Thinking of you." That was all. No apology, no request to talk, no suggestion of a visit, just those 3 words in his handwriting. I read them once, I read them again. I did not feel anything large. I walked the card into the kitchen, and I placed it on the front of the refrigerator under a magnet, shaped like a strawberry, and I left it there. I did not explain to the children what it was, and I did not take it down. Juniper noticed it within a day. She did not ask about it. Sloane noticed it within a week, and asked once whose handwriting that was, and I told her it was her grandfather's, and she nodded and went back to drawing a horse. Beckett never noticed it at all. The card stayed on the refrigerator through the entire holiday season, and through January, and through February, and it is still there. It is not a forgiveness, it is not a punishment, it is simply allowed to exist, the way some things are. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Renata called me back into her small windowless office and informed me, in the same flat tone she had used the first time, that the company was creating a new department lead position and that she was recommending me for it. The salary that came attached to the title made me sit down for a moment on the edge of her guest chair, because it was not extraordinary by any objective standard, but it was the first number in my life that belonged entirely and uncomplicatedly to me. Not a household income, not a contribution. Mine. Earned, documented, signed for, deposited into an account that had only my name on it. I accepted the position on the spot, and I drove home that afternoon, with both hands shaking very slightly on the wheel. I used the raise to find us a slightly larger apartment in the same school district, a 3-bedroom this time, in a building that had been built sometime within the last 15 years, and therefore had a dishwasher that did not announce its operation to the entire neighborhood. The bathroom tiles in the new place were a color that had also never been fashionable at any point in recorded history, a sort of mottled mint green, but every single drawer in the kitchen opened smoothly on its own little track, and there was a small balcony off the living room where I could put 2 folding chairs and a potted plant. Each of the children, for the first time in their lives, got a bedroom of their own. Sloane immediately covered one entire wall of hers in chalkboard paint and began drawing horses that did not look like horses. Juniper, who had been quiet and watchful and almost adult through every single month of the previous year, came into the kitchen one evening while I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of pasta sauce. She climbed onto one of the tall stools at the counter and rested her chin on her folded arms and watched me stir for a long, quiet moment before she spoke. She was 10 by then, and her face had begun to lengthen into something that hinted at the woman she was going to become. "Mom," she said, in that careful, measured voice of hers, "I think we are going to be okay." I stopped stirring. I looked at her. I said, "Yeah, baby. I think we are going to be okay too." She nodded once, satisfied, and slid off the stool and went to do her math homework. I stood at that stove for another minute or two after she walked away, and I let the sauce go untended, and I thought about a porch and a garbage bag, and 3 words I had whispered to no one. There is a particular kind of justice that does not come with thunder, and it took me 34 years to learn what it looks like. It does not arrive in a dramatic confrontation in someone's living room. It does not arrive in a moment when you get to watch the exact expression on a person's face as they realize they were wrong about you. It is quieter than that. It is a lease signed in your own name. It is a savings account that grows by small, disciplined amounts every 2 weeks. It is your daughter saying we are going to be okay. Last month, Juniper's elementary school held one of those family showcase evenings, the kind where children present long projects and parents wander politely through the gymnasium and drink terrible coffee from foam cups at a folding table near the door. I went, of course. I always go. I have not missed one. Juniper had been working on her project for almost 3 weeks, very privately, refusing to let me look at it until the night of the showcase. The topic, she had told me back at the beginning, was resilience. She had researched the science of it, the psychology behind it, the small specific things that cause some people to break under pressure and other people to slowly, patiently, against every reasonable expectation, rebuild. She did the entire display board herself, and she would not accept my offer of help even once. When I walked into the gymnasium that evening and saw her standing beside her board with her hands folded neatly in front of her, I felt my throat do something I did not entirely expect. The board was beautiful in its own 10-year-old way, careful hand-lettered title across the top, neat paragraphs of research below, a small section at the bottom in her own handwriting that she had clearly considered very carefully before committing to ink. The sentence at the bottom of her board, in her own slightly uneven handwriting, said this: "Resilient people don't wait to be rescued. They figure out the next step." I read it twice. I read it a third time. I did not say anything for a long moment, because I did not entirely trust my voice to hold. "I wrote that part myself," she said quietly, watching my face. "That part is not from any of my sources. That part is just from watching. Just from watching." My 10-year-old daughter, who had been 9 years old on a porch 18 months earlier, who had slipped her small hand into mine and squeezed once to tell me she was still there, had been keeping her own quiet record the entire time. She had been observing every small decision I made in the dark of motel bathrooms, and in the parking lots of grocery stores, and at the stove of a kitchen with violently yellow curtains, and she had been building, in the careful private way of careful private children, her own independent account of what she had seen. If you have made it this far with me, I want to ask you for one small thing before the story is over. If anything in what I have told you has made you think of a specific person in your own life, someone who is standing right now on some version of that porch with a bag at their feet, please share this video with them. They might need to hear that the door closing is not the end of the sentence. And in the comments below, tell me what you would say today to the person who once underestimated you, if you had the chance to speak to them on equal ground, not in anger, just in truth. I am going to read every single answer, and I think we are all going to find each other in those comments. I do not tell this story because I want anyone's pity, and I do not tell it because I am still angry, although there are days when a thin, clean version of the anger does still pass through me like weather. I tell it because I know there is at least one woman listening to my voice right now who is standing on her own version of that porch, with her own children pressed against her legs, and her own bag at her feet, asking for help from people who were supposed to love her without conditions. And the door is closing in front of her, and it feels like the end of every safe thing she has ever known. I am here to tell her, very directly, that it is not the end. It is, I promise, the beginning of a whole different life. The people who closed that door on me 18 months ago are, as far as I can tell, still living the exact same lives they were living the morning I drove away. The same house, the same routines, the same opinions, the same furniture in the same rooms. Tanner is still upstairs in his childhood bedroom. Camille is still tilting her head and dispensing wisdom to people who did not ask for it. My mother is still arranging the planters on the front porch. My father is still signing cards in his careful slanted handwriting. They are exactly where I left them, while I have been quietly, steadily, without their permission, and without their help, becoming a person they would not recognize if I walked past them in a grocery store. A puzzy one. I am the woman who picked up a black garbage bag off a porch and carried it down 4 wooden steps without looking back. And I am the woman who set that same bag down in the small front hallway of an apartment with violently yellow curtains. And I am the woman who, last week, walked out the front door of my own 3-bedroom home with my hands empty and my keys in my pocket and the door unlocked behind me because 3 children I love more than my own breathing were running ahead of me into a sunlit yard. There is no sweeter outcome than that. None at all. I learned the 3 words by heart, on a porch, in front of a door that was closing. Watch what happens.